Picture this. It's 1993 in Havana, and a beat-up 1957 Chevy pulls into a government inspection station. The inspector asks for the fuel receipt. The driver, a mechanic named Roberto Martinez, hands him something else. A receipt from a restaurant for 5 gallons of used cooking oil. The inspector thinks it's a joke until Martinez pops the hood. What he found inside that engine bay would eventually force General Motors to admit that one of their biggest engineering assumptions was completely wrong. This is the story of how a Cuban mechanic with no formal training outsmarted Detroit with a fuel system they said was impossible. The Cuban Crisis, 1991. To understand why Martinez did what he did, you need to understand Cuba in 1991. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, overnight. Cuba's biggest supplier of everything, petroleum, food, machinery, parts, just vanished. The Soviets had been sending Cuba 96,000 barrels of oil per day. Suddenly, that dropped to 12,000. 12! That's an 87% reduction in gasoline availability basically overnight. Havana went dark. Not figuratively, literally dark. Streetlights stayed off to save electricity. Factories shut down, buses stopped running. The Cuban government called it the special period, which is a very polite way of saying everyone was completely screwed. But here's what made it particularly brutal for car owners. Cuba had been isolated since the 1960 embargo. That meant the newest cars on the island were from 59, 58, 57. These weren't collector cars, they were daily drivers, work trucks, taxis, the entire transportation infrastructure of the country, and they all needed gasoline. Gasoline that no longer existed. The government implemented rationing so severe, it made the 1970s gas crisis look like a minor inconvenience. You got 4 gallons per month. 4. For context, a 1957 Chevy Bel Air gets about 14 miles per gallon. That meant you could drive 56 miles per month before you were walking. In a country where public transportation had ceased to exist, people got creative. They had to. Some built bicycle taxis. Others converted cars to run on propane from cooking tanks. A few tried to make moonshine work as fuel, which ended about as well as you'd expect. Engines seized, fuel lines corroded. Entire cars turned into lawn ornaments. The average Cuban car owner in '91 was facing a choice. Stop driving or figure something else out. But here's where it gets interesting. Cuba had something most countries didn't. An entire generation of mechanics who could fix anything with nothing. These weren't shade tree mechanics. They were engineers without degrees, metallurgists without labs. They'd been keeping 1950s American cars running for 30 years with no parts, no manuals, no help from Detroit. They'd fabricated everything from piston rings to carburetors using scrap metal and Soviet tractor parts. These guys were so good that vintage car restorers in America would later pay thousands of dollars just to learn their techniques. They could bore out a cylinder with a hand drill, cast new engine mounts from melted aluminum cans, rebuild a transmission using gears from a sugar mill. When you can't buy parts, you make them. When you can't make them, you improvise. When you can't improvise, you invent. This culture of mechanical improvisation meant that when the gas disappeared, Cuban mechanics didn't just accept it. They went to war with reality. And Roberto Martinez, a 43-year-old mechanic from a Havana neighborhood called Vedado, was about to win that war in a way nobody expected. Martinez worked at what had been a state-run garage before the special period. Now it was basically a mechanical hospice where cars came to die. His specialty was Chevrolets, specifically the small block V8s that powered most of the American cars still running on the island. He knew these engines better than GM engineers did. He'd rebuilt hundreds of them. He understood every tolerance, every weakness, every quirk. He also understood something Detroit had forgotten. These engines were designed in an era before computers, before emissions controls, before fuel injection. They were agricultural in their simplicity. Cast iron blocks, mechanical fuel pumps, carburetors that were basically calibrated holes in metal. If you understood the fundamentals, combustion, compression, ignition, you could make them run on almost anything that burned. Almost anything. Enter Roberto Martinez. Martinez wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was just trying to get to work. His own car, a '57 Bel Air that he'd inherited from his father, was sitting in his driveway with an empty tank and no hope of refilling it legally. The 4-gallon monthly ration went to his wife, who needed it for her job at a hospital. Martinez was stuck. One night in June of '92, he was eating dinner. Rice and beans fried in cooking oil because meat was basically a memory. His wife was complaining about how much cooking oil they went through. The government rationed that too, but not as strictly as gasoline. You could get maybe 3 liters a month, sometimes more if you knew the right people. Martinez wasn't really listening. He was thinking about diesel engines. Diesel engines could run on vegetable oil. That was proven technology. Rudolf Diesel himself had demonstrated his engine running on peanut oil at the 1900 World's Fair. The French government had tested palm oil in diesel engines in the 1930s. During World War II, Japan ran military trucks on pine root oil when petroleum got scarce. But Martinez didn't have a diesel. He had a gasoline engine, a 283 cubic inch small block Chevy V8 with a 2-barrel carburetor and 7.2-to-1. Compression. You couldn't just pour cooking oil into a gasoline engine. The viscosity was wrong. The ignition requirements were different. Gasoline engines needed spark plugs to ignite the fuel. Diesel engines used compression. Vegetable oil was too thick for carburetors and wouldn't vaporize properly in the combustion chamber. Every mechanical engineering textbook said it was impossible. But Martinez was thinking about those textbooks. He'd never read them. He'd learned everything from his father, who'd learned from his father, who'd learned by doing, not reading. And something was bothering him. If diesel engines could run on vegetable oil by compression igniting it, and gasoline engines could be made to run at higher compression ratios, what if you could modify a gasoline engine to compression ignite vegetable oil? It was a stupid idea. Crazy. Gasoline engines weren't built for compression ignition. The combustion chambers were the wrong shape. The pistons would crack, the valves would burn, the oil would never vaporize properly. Every engineer at General Motors would have laughed him out of the room. Martinez grabbed his wife's cooking oil, went outside, started thinking. The problem wasn't just the fuel, it was the entire system. Gasoline engines were designed around gasoline's properties: low viscosity, high volatility, specific octane rating, specific energy density. Vegetable oil was different in every way. Thicker, less volatile, different ignition characteristics, different energy content. To make it work, you'd need to change everything. The fuel delivery, the combustion process, the ignition timing, probably the compression ratio. It should have been impossible. But Martinez had something GM engineers didn't. He had no choice. His car needed to run. He had no gasoline. He had cooking oil. Therefore, cooking oil had to work. It was that simple. The physics would just have to catch up with necessity. That's the thing about innovation. It usually comes from people who don't know enough to understand why something can't be done. The forbidden solution. Martinez started with the obvious problem: viscosity. Vegetable oil at room temperature was about 11 times thicker than gasoline. You can't spray something that thick through a carburetor jet. The fuel wouldn't atomize. It wouldn't mix with air properly. It would just sit there like syrup, clogging everything. His first thought was preheating. If you heat vegetable oil to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit, the viscosity drops to something close to diesel fuel, still thicker than gasoline, but workable. The question was how to preheat the fuel before it hit the carburetor without burning down the car. He started experimenting with a copper coil wrapped around the exhaust manifold. The exhaust heat would warm the fuel line, thinning the oil before it reached the carburetor. Simple, elegant. Except it didn't work. The oil got too hot, started breaking down, and produced varnish that clogged everything worse than before. Next attempt. He moved the heating coil to the intake manifold, using engine coolant to warm the fuel. Better, but not enough. The oil was still too thick to spray properly through the carburetor jets. He needed something more aggressive. This is where Martinez made his first real innovation. He realized the carburetor wasn't just a fuel delivery device. It was an emulsifier. It mixed fuel and air. What if he could pre-mix the vegetable oil with something thinner before it even reached the carburetor? He started adding gasoline to the vegetable oil. 10% gasoline, 90% oil. The mixture was thin enough to flow, and the gasoline acted as a carrier fluid for the oil. It worked, sort of. The engine would start and run, but only at idle. Under load, it would stumble, misfire, and eventually stall. The problem was combustion. Vegetable oil needs more time to burn than gasoline. The flame front moves slower. In a gasoline engine spinning at 2,000 RPM, there isn't enough time for complete combustion. You end up with unburned oil coating everything. Martinez needed to increase combustion efficiency. That meant either slowing down the engine or speeding up the burn. Slowing down the engine wasn't an option. That left speeding up the burn. He started playing with ignition timing, advancing it by 15 degrees. More advanced meant the spark fired earlier, giving the oil more time to burn before the piston reached top dead center. The engine ran better, much better, but now he had a new problem. Pre-ignition. The vegetable oil would spontaneously ignite before the spark plug fired, causing the engine to knock itself to death. This is where most people would have given up. Martinez just got more creative. He realized that pre-ignition was actually compression ignition. The oil was igniting from cylinder pressure alone, like a diesel. That's what was supposed to be impossible, but it was happening. So instead of fighting it, what if he embraced it? Martinez started raising the compression ratio. He milled the cylinder heads, reducing the combustion chamber volume. He swapped pistons for a higher compression version from a different engine. He sealed off the spark plug holes and tried to run the engine as a pure compression ignition design. It didn't work. The compression ratio needed to be somewhere around 18:1 for reliable compression ignition. His engine topped out at maybe 9:1 after modifications. Not enough. He needed spark ignition, but timed for compression ignition characteristics. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He used both. He kept the spark plugs but retarded the timing so far that the oil was already compression igniting by the time the plug fired. The spark plug just completed the combustion, ensuring everything burned. It was a hybrid system, part spark ignition, part compression ignition, something that shouldn't exist, but it worked. The engine ran, not smoothly, not quietly. It sounded like an angry tractor having a nervous breakdown, but it ran. On pure vegetable oil with just a splash of gasoline for cold starts. Martinez had created something new, something weird, something GM's engineers had never considered because they'd never needed to. He'd created a compression-assisted spark ignition engine, fueled by cooking oil, and he'd done it in his driveway with hand tools. Engineering the impossible word spread fast. In a place where everyone knew everyone and nobody had gasoline, Martinez's running car was like spotting a unicorn. Neighbors started showing up at his garage, at first just to look, then to ask questions, then to beg him to convert their cars. Martinez was hesitant. This was Cuba in 1993. The government controlled everything. Modifying cars without permission was illegal. Using non-approved fuels was illegal. Hell, succeeding at anything without the state's involvement was ideologically suspect. But these were his neighbors, people he'd known for 30 years. They needed help. He started with simple conversions. The preheater coil on the exhaust manifold, enlarged carburetor jets to flow the thicker fuel, advanced ignition timing, basic modifications that any mechanic could do with normal tools. These worked okay on low compression engines. They'd run on a mixture of 70% vegetable oil, 30% gasoline. Not perfect, but good enough to triple someone's driving range. But Martinez knew he could do better. He started experimenting with more aggressive modifications. He was particularly obsessed with the carburetor. Standard carburetors use tiny brass jets to meter fuel flow. These jets were precisely drilled to specific diameters, too small for vegetable oil. Martinez started drilling them out, making them larger. The problem was maintaining atomization. Bigger jets flowed more fuel, but the droplets got larger. Large droplets don't burn efficiently. He needed a way to break up the fuel into smaller particles after it passed through the enlarged jets. His solution was adding what he called an emulsion chamber, a small cavity in the carburetor where the oil mixed with compressed air from the intake, creating a fine mist before entering the venturi. He fabricated these chambers from bronze pipe fittings and steel wool, creating a crude but effective atomizer. The results were dramatic. Engines could now run on pure vegetable oil with no gasoline additive. Startup required a small amount of gasoline in a separate tank, enough to get the engine warm. Once it reached operating temperature, you'd flip a valve and switch to pure vegetable oil. The system worked so well that fuel consumption was actually similar to gasoline. About 12 miles per gallon of vegetable oil in a full-size Chevy. But Martinez wasn't done. He was bothered by the inefficiency. Vegetable oil has about 90% the energy content of gasoline. His engines were getting worse fuel economy, not better. That meant they were leaving energy on the table. He started analyzing combustion efficiency. The problem was incomplete combustion. Vegetable oil molecules are much larger than gasoline molecules. They're triglycerides, essentially long chains of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These long chains take more time to break apart and burn. At typical engine speeds, 30 to 40% of the oil was passing through the engine, partially burned or unburned, wasted out the exhaust. Martinez needed to increase residence time in the combustion chamber. That meant either slowing down the engine, which wasn't practical, or changing the combustion chamber geometry to promote better mixing. He started modifying cylinder heads, reshaping the combustion chambers to create more turbulence. He used crude tools, a die grinder, some carbide bits, a steady hand. He couldn't measure airflow or simulate combustion. He just tried things and tested them. One design in particular worked incredibly well. He created what he called a toroidal chamber, a donut-shaped recess in the piston crown that forced the air-fuel mixture to swirl violently during compression. This swirling action broke up the oil droplets further and ensured complete mixing with the air. Combustion efficiency jumped to over 90%. Fuel economy improved to 14 miles per gallon, better than the same engine running on gasoline. Let that sink in. A backyard mechanic in Cuba, with no engineering degree, no computer simulations, no flow bench, no proper tools, had created an engine that ran more efficiently on vegetable oil than the original GM design did on gasoline. He'd also created a diesel-like compression ignition assist system without actually building a diesel engine. The spark plugs were still there, still firing, but they were more like glow plugs in a diesel. They initiated combustion that was already trying to happen from compression. It was a hybrid combustion system that existed nowhere in automotive literature. The modifications were relatively simple. Enlarge the carburetor jets, add the emulsion chamber, advance and then retard ignition timing in a specific sequence, reshape the combustion chambers, install a dual-tank fuel system with a switchover valve. Total parts cost was maybe $20 in materials. The labor was free if you did it yourself. By mid-94, Martinez had converted over 50 cars in his neighborhood, all of them running primarily on cooking oil. The fuel came from restaurants, which were desperate to get rid of used cooking oil anyway. Most places would give it away. Some charged a tiny amount, maybe the equivalent of 50 cents per gallon. Compare that to gasoline, which when you could even find it on the black market, cost $15 to $20 per gallon. The economics were absurd. People were spending 95% less on fuel. Cars that had been parked for years were back on the road. Martinez had accidentally created an underground fuel economy that existed completely outside government control. That's when things got interesting. Detroit's nightmare. General Motors knew about Martinez. Of course they did. They had researchers in Cuba studying the special period as a case study in automotive survival under extreme conditions. They documented the improvised repairs, the fabricated parts, the creative solutions. It was all fascinating from an academic perspective. But the cooking oil conversions were different. They challenged fundamental assumptions. Internal GM memos from 1995, obtained later through automotive historians, showed genuine confusion. One engineer wrote, "Subject Martinez's modification should not be possible in a spark ignition engine. Vegetable oil requires compression ratios above 15:1 for reliable ignition. Subject reports achieving stable operation at 9.5:1. This contradicts established combustion theory." Another memo was more direct. "Either our understanding of combustion chemistry is incomplete, or the reports from Cuba are exaggerated. Recommend further investigation." GM sent a team to Cuba in '96 under the guise of humanitarian automotive aid. What they found shocked them. Over 300 cars in Havana were running on Martinez's system, not prototypes, daily drivers, taxis, delivery trucks, cars that were accumulating thousands of miles on vegetable oil with minimal issues. The GM engineers inspected several conversions. Their report was damning. Modifications are crude, but functionally sound. Combustion efficiency approaches diesel levels. Hydrocarbon emissions are significantly lower than gasoline. Carbon monoxide emissions are nearly undetectable. The system works. But here's where corporate America and Cuban reality collided. The system only worked because Cuban mechanics had skills GM engineers lacked. The combustion chamber modifications weren't something you could program into a CNC machine. They required handwork, feel, experience. The timing adjustments weren't following any formula. They were adjusted by ear until the engine ran smoothly. The emulsion chambers weren't precision machine parts. They were fabricated from plumbing fittings. GM couldn't replicate this in a factory. They couldn't standardize it. They couldn't scale it. It was artisan engineering in an age of mass production. More importantly, it threatened their entire business model. If people could run cars on cooking oil, what happened to the petroleum industry? What happened to part sales? What happened to planned obsolescence? The internal recommendation was predictable. Technology is interesting but not commercially viable. Modifications require excessive labor. Emissions compliance in U.S. market would be problematic. Recommend no further action. Translation: this works, but we're going to pretend it doesn't because acknowledging it would be inconvenient. But the story gets weirder. Several GM engineers who'd visited Cuba left the company over the next few years. Some went to work for alternative fuel startups. Others became consultants. A few published papers on vegetable oil combustion. One engineer, James Chen, later admitted in an interview that the Cuba trip had shaken his faith in corporate automotive engineering. "We thought we knew everything," Chen said in 2008. "We had supercomputers, wind tunnels, millions of dollars in research budgets. And this guy in Havana with a socket set and a welder had figured out something we declared impossible. It was humbling." Chen later founded a company developing vegetable oil conversion kits for diesel engines. He always credited Martinez as his inspiration, though the two never met. Meanwhile, in Cuba, the government was dealing with Martinez in its own way. They couldn't arrest him. He was solving a problem they couldn't solve. He was keeping the transportation infrastructure alive through the worst economic period in Cuban history. But they also couldn't officially endorse him. That would mean admitting a private citizen had succeeded where state engineers had failed. The solution was typical bureaucratic genius. Ignore it. Don't mention it. Don't regulate it. Don't ban it. Just pretend it doesn't exist. Martinez kept converting cars. The government kept pretending not to notice. And hundreds of people kept driving on cooking oil. It was a very Cuban compromise. Technically illegal, practically essential, officially invisible. The underground movement by 2000, the special period was technically over. Oil imports had increased. The economy had stabilized somewhat. But the cooking oil conversions didn't stop. Why would they? Free fuel is free fuel. Martinez had trained dozens of other mechanics in his techniques. They'd trained others. The knowledge spread like a virus through the Cuban automotive underground. By 2005, estimates suggested over 1,000 cars in Cuba were running primarily on vegetable oil. The government finally acknowledged it, sort of. They issued a regulation stating that vegetable oil conversions were technically illegal, but would not be prosecuted if the engine passed emissions testing. Since vegetable oil engines produce cleaner exhaust than gasoline engines, this was essentially a free pass. The international community started paying attention. alternative fuel advocates in Europe and America heard about the Cuban conversions. Some visited. Some tried to replicate the modifications. Most failed. The problem was always the same. They approached it as engineering. Martinez had approached it as problem solving. There's a difference. Engineering says here are the constraints. Design within them. Problem solving says here's the problem, ignore the constraints. Martinez never asked if vegetable oil should work in a gasoline engine. He asked how to make it work. That subtle shift in perspective made all the difference. By 2010, several American companies were selling vegetable oil conversion kits. None of them used Martinez's techniques exactly. They couldn't. Patent law is complicated, but more importantly, Martinez's methods were impossible to standardize. Every engine was different. Every conversion required custom modifications. You couldn't package it in a box with instructions, but the principles were spreading. The idea that vegetable oil combustion could be achieved in a spark ignition engine. The concept of compression-assisted spark ignition. The use of emulsion chambers for better atomization. These ideas were entering mainstream alternative fuel research, usually without credit to their source. Martinez didn't care. He'd never wanted fame or money. He'd wanted his car to run. Mission accomplished. He continued working at his garage in Vedado, converting cars when people asked, mostly retired now, mostly enjoying life. Reporters occasionally showed up. He'd talk to them, explain his modifications, and then go back to work. He never made grand claims, never said he'd revolutionized anything. In his mind, he'd just fixed a car. The fact that he'd done it in a way that contradicted 40 years of automotive engineering was irrelevant. The Cuban government eventually gave him an award in 2015. Some engineering recognition for contributions to national transportation. He accepted it politely and put it in a drawer. The cars mattered. The award didn't. Why it actually worked. So what was Martinez actually doing? How did he make something work that GM said was impossible? How does a guy in a Havana garage with hand tools accomplish what Detroit engineers with supercomputers couldn't? The answer lies in understanding what combustion really is. It's not magic. It's not even that complicated. It's just chemistry. You need three things: fuel, oxygen, and heat. That's it. The type of fuel doesn't matter as much as engineers think it does. What matters is getting the mixture right and maintaining enough heat for complete combustion. Everything else is just details. Vegetable oil has all the properties needed for combustion. It's hydrocarbons, just like gasoline, just like diesel, just like kerosene. Longer chain hydrocarbons, sure, but still carbon and hydrogen that desperately want to combine with oxygen and release energy. That's what combustion is. Rapid oxidation. The challenge isn't making vegetable oil burn. Anything will burn if you heat it enough. The challenge is breaking those long molecular chains apart fast enough at typical engine speeds. This is where GM engineers got stuck. They looked at vegetable oil's molecular structure and said it won't work in a gasoline engine. Too thick, too slow to vaporize, wrong ignition characteristics. They were right about the properties. They were wrong about the conclusion. Martinez solved this with three key innovations, none of which appeared in any textbook. First, the preheating system thinned the oil enough to atomize properly. By warming it to 160 degrees before it hit the carburetor, he dropped the viscosity to something manageable. Not gasoline thin, but workable. Second, the emulsion chamber broke the oil into tiny droplets with massive surface area. This is critical. Combustion happens at the surface of fuel droplets. Bigger droplets mean less surface area, slower burning. Martinez's crude bronze chamber created a mist so fine it behaved almost like vaporized fuel. Third, the modified combustion chambers created turbulence that ensured complete mixing with air. He reshaped the chambers to force the air-fuel mixture to swirl violently. This swirling kept the oil droplets suspended, prevented them from pooling, and guaranteed every molecule of fuel found oxygen to react with. But the real genius, The part that made GM engineers question their entire education was the compression-assisted spark ignition. By raising compression and retarding timing, Martinez created conditions where the oil was already starting to auto-ignite from compression alone. The heat and pressure in the cylinder were enough to begin combustion without the spark. The spark plug just completed the process, ensured everything burned completely. It wasn't pure compression ignition like a diesel. It wasn't pure spark ignition like a gasoline engine. It was both. A hybrid combustion mode that existed in a gray area between the two. Something that shouldn't exist according to conventional engine design. Modern research has confirmed this works. Several papers published in the 2000s documented similar combustion modes achieved in laboratory engines. They gave it a fancy name, HCCI, homogeneous charge compression ignition. They acted like they discovered something new. Martinez had been doing it since '93 with a socket set and a dream. The efficiency gains came from complete combustion and higher compression ratios. Vegetable oil's higher cetane number meant it was actually better suited for compression ignition than gasoline. Martinez had accidentally optimized the engine for the fuel, rather than trying to force the fuel to work in an unmodified engine. It was brilliant, and it only worked because he didn't know it shouldn't. The legacy today: Martinez is 74 years old, still living in Havana, still working on cars occasionally. His original 57 Bel Air still runs, still burns cooking oil, still carries him around the city. The special period is a memory. Cuba has gasoline now, but hundreds of cars still run on cooking oil because it's cheaper and cleaner. The technique Martinez pioneered has influenced alternative fuel research worldwide. Companies developing renewable fuel systems cite Cuban vegetable oil conversions as proof of concept. General Motors never officially acknowledged Martinez. They couldn't. Admitting that a Cuban mechanic with no formal training had solved a problem they'd declared unsolvable would have been embarrassing. But several former GM engineers have gone on record stating that the Cuba research changed how they thought about combustion. The story of Roberto Martinez is really a story about necessity and innovation, about how constraints breed creativity, about how the best solutions often come from people who don't know enough to understand why something can't work. Detroit had all the resources, all the knowledge, all the technology. Martinez had a socket set and no choice. He won. Sometimes the best engineering comes from people who have to fix things, not design them.